Respect from Modi and Sundar Pichai united the spirits of India and Pakistan. The hall was silent. Rows of chairs were filled with leaders, students, and workers from both India and Pakistan. Cameras flashed, but the silence was not heavy. It was respectful, like everyone in that room knew they were standing on the edge of something different, something bigger than just politics or business. People leaned forward in their seats, waiting for what would happen next. At the center of the stage stood two men who came from different paths but carried the same weight of responsibility. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, carried the hopes of a nation that had survived centuries of struggle. Beside him was Sundar Pichai, a man who had walked from the small streets of Chennai to the highest offices of Silicon Valley, now guiding one of the world's most powerful companies. When they looked at each other, they did not see only titles. They saw two stories of resilience, two lives shaped by humble beginnings and lifted by courage. The moment began with a small gesture. Modi folded his hands, a traditional namaste, directed not at the cameras but toward Sundar. It was not scripted. It was not political theater. It was personal, human, and real. Sundar responded by lowering his head slightly with a quiet smile. In that moment, the cameras captured something rare. Two powerful figures showing humility to each other. For years, India and Pakistan had been seen through the lens of conflict. Borders and history had built walls that words could not easily break. But in this hall, on this stage, the story was different. Sitting in the front rows were young men and women from both nations, students who had crossed borders to be part of a cultural and technology exchange. They had grown up hearing stories of division, but now they were witnessing respect. A boy from Lahore whispered to his friend from Delhi, "Do you see that? They are showing us how to stand together." The friend nodded, his eyes shining. It was more than a handshake or a speech. It was proof that respect was stronger than pride, and kindness was louder than old anger. As the hall watched, Sundar began to speak. His words were simple, his tone calm, but the weight of each sentence pressed deep into the hearts of the audience. He spoke about his mother's sacrifices, about studying under a dim lamp, about standing in long lines for water, and about never losing hope. He said, "When I look back, I do not remember the struggles with bitterness. I remember them with gratitude. Those struggles gave me strength." The audience leaned closer. Some people had tears in their eyes. They could see themselves in his story. They could see their own mothers, their own fathers, their own small homes. And then Sundar turned his words toward the students from Pakistan and India. He said, "When you respect one another, you create more than friendship. You create possibility. Respect is the seed of every bridge." The silence in the hall broke into a wave of applause. But this applause was not loud with noise. It was loud with meaning. Hands clapped not because they were told to, but because their hearts demanded it. Modi turned toward Sundar, his face softer than anyone had expected. He spoke slowly, and his words carried the gravity of a leader who had lived through storms. "Respect," he said, "is not weakness. Respect is courage. Only the strong can bow their head and honor another. Only the wise can lower their voice and listen." Those words traveled like a spark across the hall. Young students felt their spirits lifted. Teachers felt a sense of hope. Journalists lowered their pens for a moment because even they could not capture in ink what was happening in the air. And in the middle row sat two older men, one from Lahore, one from Mumbai. They had fought in wars decades ago, on opposite sides of the border. When they heard Modi's words, their eyes met. Both men were silent for a moment. Then one slowly raised his hand and saluted the other. It was not planned. It was not asked for. It was respect born from the respect they had just witnessed on stage. The tension that had existed between the two nations felt different inside that hall. For the first time, young and old, rich and poor, leaders and citizens felt that respect could be more powerful than division. They felt that maybe, just maybe, they were not enemies but neighbors with shared pain and shared dreams. The night ended with a symbolic gesture. Students from India and Pakistan walked onto the stage together. They carried their national flags, but they held them side by side, not against each other. The audience rose to their feet. People did not stand for one flag or the other. They stood for the moment itself. Modi and Sundar both stepped back, giving the stage to the young generation. And the message became clear. Leaders can open the door, but it is the young who must walk through it with respect and humility. Outside the hall, reporters rushed to send headlines. But no headline could fully explain what people had just felt. Respect had not only been spoken, it had been shown. And in that showing, the spirits of India and Pakistan had been touched. The story of this night would not end in that hall. It would travel through families, through schools, through streets, and across borders. It would become a seed planted in countless hearts. And like every true seed, it would grow slowly but firmly. And so, what began as a meeting of two leaders became a story of millions. It became proof that humility is not silence, that respect is not weakness, and that kindness is not naive. It became the first chapter of a journey where India and Pakistan could see not only the scars of their past, but also the light of their shared future. Respect from Modi and Sundar Pichai united the spirits of India and Pakistan. The night after the historic event, the city was alive with quiet conversations. People in cafes, homes, and even on crowded buses spoke of what they had seen. Not everyone had been inside the hall, but everyone seemed to know the story. In Delhi, in Lahore, in Karachi, in Mumbai, words traveled faster than the news channels could broadcast. The story was not just about politics, not just about technology, and not just about speeches. It was about two men who had shown the world that humility could be stronger than rivalry. In a small tea stall on the border town of Wagah, an old shopkeeper listened to the radio. His hands trembled as he placed clay cups of steaming chai in front of two truck drivers. One was Indian, the other Pakistani. They had stopped at his shop many times, and most days their conversations carried a sharp edge, teasing and mocking each other's nations. But tonight, the radio told the story of Modi's folded hands and Sundar's quiet bow. The shopkeeper watched in silence as the two drivers looked at each other and, for the first time, shared a smile without sarcasm. One of them whispered, "Maybe respect can do what wars never could." Thousands of miles away in California, Sundar Pichai sat alone in his hotel room. The applause from the hall still echoed in his ears, but his mind wandered back to his childhood. He remembered waiting in line with his father to buy a newspaper, the smell of ink and dust, the voices of neighbors arguing about politics. He remembered how his mother would always tell him, "Humility is your strength, not your weakness." That memory made him smile. He realized that what happened tonight was not about him or his success. It was about showing the next generation that respect can cross any border. But not everyone celebrated. In some political offices and media rooms, men in suits argued angrily. They feared that too much respect could weaken their control. They whispered that kindness was dangerous because it removed the fear that kept people divided. In one meeting, a powerful voice said, "If India and Pakistan start seeing each other as brothers, then who will listen to us?" Those words revealed the hidden fear of those who thrived on conflict. The stage of respect had planted seeds, but seeds always attract storms. Back in India, Prime Minister Modi walked through the corridors of his residence. The night was quiet, but his thoughts were not. He thought of his childhood in Vadnagar, selling tea on train platforms, listening to travelers speak of faraway lands. He thought of how hardship had shaped him, of how respect was something he had learned not from books, but from life itself. He asked himself a question that had no easy answer. Could respect truly change the destiny of nations, or was it just a fragile moment that would fade in the face of anger? The next morning, students who had been in the hall returned to their homes. One girl from Islamabad wrote in her diary, "When I saw Modi bow his head and Sundar smile with humility, I felt something shift inside me. I no longer wanted to see India as an enemy. I wanted to see them as people, just like us." In Delhi, a boy who had never spoken to his Pakistani classmates opened his phone and typed a message. "I want to be friends, even if our flags are different." Across borders, replies began to flow. Respect was no longer just on the stage. It was in the hearts of the young. But change is never simple. While many celebrated, some people carried anger in their hearts. They said the show of respect was only a trick, only a mask. They said old wounds could not heal with bows and smiles. On television debates, loud voices argued, trying to drown the silence of humility with noise. Yet despite the noise, something deeper remained. People who had seen the event with their own eyes knew that respect had been real, and real things are not easily erased. The turning point came when a video went viral. It showed two elderly men, one Indian and one Pakistani, walking side by side outside the hall after the event. They held each other's hands, their faces lined with years of history, their steps slow but steady. The video had no words, no music, no commentary. It did not need any. Millions watched it, and millions felt the same quiet truth. If they can hold hands after all they had lived through, then so could we. Inside Sundar's heart, however, there was a weight he had not spoken of. He knew respect was a beginning, but he also knew that beginnings are fragile. One misstep, one insult, one careless word could undo everything, and he wondered if the world was ready for such delicate change. The story was spreading, but so were the doubts. The question hung heavy in the air. Was this respect a spark that would light a fire of unity, or would it be crushed by the storms of suspicion? The morning sun rose over Delhi, painting the sky in soft orange light. Streets were busy, as always, but there was a subtle difference in the air. It was not something you could touch or measure, but people felt it. Conversations had shifted. For years, news between India and Pakistan had often been heavy with anger, filled with blame and fear. But now, as chai vendors served cups to morning customers and children rushed to school, the whispers carried a different tone. People were talking about respect. They were talking about how two men, in one single moment, had changed the way they looked at each other. In Lahore, a teacher stood before her classroom of teenagers. Her students were restless, their minds buzzing with questions after seeing videos of the event. She looked at them and said, "What you saw on that stage was not just respect between two leaders, it was a lesson. When we respect others, even those we once called enemies, we free ourselves first. We stop being prisoners of hate." Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with emotion. Some students wiped their eyes. Others raised their hands to ask if peace was truly possible. She did not answer with certainty. Instead, she told them, "Peace begins in your heart, with the respect you choose to give." But as respect spread among the people, shadows began to move behind closed doors. In a hidden room in Karachi, men with stern faces sat around a long table. Their voices were sharp, their words filled with distrust. One of them slammed his fist on the table and declared, "This show of unity will destroy everything we have built. If the people begin to respect each other, they will no longer follow us. We need their anger to keep our power." Another nodded, adding, "We must find a way to turn their respect into doubt." These words revealed the truth. Not everyone wanted peace. For some, division was profit and fear was control. Meanwhile, Sundar Pichai traveled quietly to a local school in Delhi. It was not part of his official schedule, but he wanted to meet children who had been inspired by his story. When he entered a small classroom, the students stood up at once. Their eyes sparkled and their voices trembled as they greeted him. Sundar walked slowly among them, stopping to listen as a young girl told him how she wanted to become an engineer like him. Her family was poor, but she said, "If you could do it, maybe I can too." Sundar bent down, looking her in the eyes, and said softly, "Do not say maybe. Say you will." That moment lit up the room more than any spotlight could. Prime Minister Modi, on the other hand, spent his day in meetings with advisors. Some were hopeful, saying the respect shown in the hall had opened a new path. Others were worried, warning him that not everyone would accept it. One advisor whispered, "Sir, respect is powerful, but it is fragile. If even one spark of violence happens, people will forget humility and return to fear." Modi listened carefully, his hands folded. His face was calm, but his heart was restless. He knew the truth. Respect could be built slowly, but it could also be destroyed in seconds. In Pakistan, a young boy named Ahmed sat by a window, sketching in his notebook. He had drawn two hands reaching for each other, one holding the Indian flag, the other holding the Pakistani flag. His father, a man hardened by years of anger, saw the drawing and frowned. "Why are you wasting your time with this?" he asked. The boy looked up, his eyes steady. Because I believe respect is stronger than hate, he said. For a moment, silence filled the room. The father's face softened, though he did not admit it. Deep down, he felt a seed of hope he had buried long ago begin to stir again. As night fell, television screens across both nations were filled with debates. Some commentators praised the event as a new chapter of unity. Others dismissed it as nothing more than empty symbolism. But beyond the noise, ordinary people kept sharing their stories. A farmer in Punjab told his neighbor, "I saw Modi fold his hands. It reminded me of how my father always taught me to bow to others, no matter their status." The neighbor nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. Yet, just as the spirit of respect was growing, a troubling rumor began to spread. Whispers claimed that the event had been staged, that the respect shown was only for cameras. The rumor grew quickly, like fire on dry grass, feeding the doubts of those who already struggled to believe in peace. Students argued with teachers, neighbors argued with neighbors, and once again, the fragile balance trembled. Sundar heard of the rumor late that evening. He sat by the window of his hotel, staring out at the lights of Delhi, and he felt the weight of disappointment pressing against his chest. But instead of anger, he closed his eyes and thought of the children he had met that morning. Their eyes had been filled with hope, not with doubt, and he whispered to himself, "The truth of respect is not in what people say, it is in what people feel. They cannot take that away." Modi, too, was aware of the growing doubts. He stood in his study, looking at a portrait of Mahatma Gandhi. He remembered Gandhi's words, "The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong." He realized that respect was no different. It would take strength to hold it against the storm of suspicion. And he made a decision. He would not defend respect with speeches alone. He would defend it with actions. The rumors spread like a cold wind. On both sides of the border, whispers turned into arguments, and arguments turned into doubt. In tea houses of Lahore, men leaned over small wooden tables and shook their heads. "It was all for the cameras," one man said bitterly. "They don't mean it. They just want us to forget the past." Across the border, in a crowded bus in Delhi, a woman argued with her neighbor. "You did not see their eyes?" she said fiercely. "It was real." "No camera can fake humility like that." Her voice trembled, not because she doubted, but because she was afraid others would stop believing. This fragile moment of doubt was exactly what some powerful men had been waiting for. Behind closed doors in Islamabad, a group of politicians sat in silence until one finally spoke. "This is our chance. If people start thinking it was staged, then respect will die before it can take root." Another nodded, his face grim. "We must act fast. Once hope spreads, it cannot be controlled." Similar meetings happened in Delhi, too, where a few voices whispered warnings that unity might weaken national pride. These were not the voices of the people, but the voices of those who lived on division. Sundar Pichai, meanwhile, walked into a quiet room filled with students who had gathered to ask him questions. Their faces were young, but their questions carried the weight of generations. One boy asked, "Sir, how do we know if respect is real when everyone tells us different stories?" Sundar paused, his eyes gentle. He told them, "Truth is not always in words. Truth is in actions that cannot be denied. I cannot tell you what to believe, but I can show you what respect looks like, and you must carry it forward." The boy listened, and though doubt still lingered, a small flame of belief returned to his eyes. Prime Minister Modi decided to act as well. He announced a new program that would bring students from Pakistan to India and students from India to Pakistan to study together, eat together, and live as guests in each other's homes. This was not just about technology or politics. It was about teaching respect where it mattered most, in the daily lives of ordinary people. Many praised the program, calling it a bridge for the future. But critics shouted louder, warning of betrayal, warning of hidden dangers. Still, Modi remained steady. He knew that respect without risk was not real respect at all. In a small village near the border, a family from India prepared to welcome a Pakistani student into their home. The father cleaned the courtyard, the mother cooked food, and their daughter watched with curiosity. She asked, "Papa, why are we doing this?" The father smiled softly and said, "Because respect begins at home. If we cannot open our doors, how can we open our hearts?" When the student arrived, shy and nervous, The daughter offered him a plate of food. The boy hesitated, then smiled. In that small act, two young lives learned what leaders had tried to teach. But as hope grew stronger in small homes and schools, anger grew stronger in darker corners. Groups that thrived on hate began to plan ways to sabotage the movement. Late one night, a building where Indian and Pakistani students were scheduled to meet was vandalized. Walls were covered in hateful slogans and chairs were broken. The next morning, students stood outside, their faces pale with shock. Some wanted to give up, believing the critics were right. But then one girl from Karachi stepped forward. She picked up a piece of broken chalk and wrote on the wall, covering the hate with new words. Respect cannot be broken. Others joined her, writing their own messages of unity until the wall of hate had been buried beneath a wall of hope. Sundar heard of this act and felt tears well in his eyes. He knew then that the battle was no longer his alone, nor Modi's. It belonged to the young, to those who had seen respect and wanted to keep it alive. Modi, too, when he read the reports, felt the same. He whispered to himself, "The true strength of respect is not in speeches, but in what people choose to do when they are tested." The storm was growing, and everyone could feel it. Respect had taken its first steps into the world, but enemies of peace were sharpening their knives. Every rumor, every act of sabotage, every word of anger was meant to crush the fragile seed before it could grow into something unshakable. The attack on the student building had shaken many hearts, but it had not destroyed the spirit of respect. Still, the shadows grew bolder. In both nations, groups that thrived on hate began to step out from the corners, louder than before. They printed pamphlets, spread false stories, and filled the air with suspicion. Television debates grew more heated, with angry voices shouting over one another. Every evening, families sat in front of their screens, watching as arguments replaced dialogue. Some shook their heads in disappointment, while others allowed anger to creep into their hearts once again. In Lahore, a father sat with his young son who had just returned from a gathering of students that promoted peace. The boy's eyes were bright, his voice full of hope, but the father's face was tight with worry. "Son," he said, "I admire your courage, but you must be careful. People who speak of unity are not always welcomed. Sometimes respect makes you a target." The boy's smile faded for a moment, but then he whispered, "If respect makes me a target, then I would rather be a target than a prisoner of hate." The father turned away, hiding the tears that filled his eyes. Sundar Pichai heard reports of these rising tensions and sat in a quiet room with a small group of young volunteers. They were students from both India and Pakistan who had decided to carry the message of respect into schools, neighborhoods, and villages. Sundar listened as one of them described how she was insulted in her own town for joining the program. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was steady. "They called me a traitor," she said, "but I told them respect is not betrayal. It is the bravest form of loyalty." Sundar looked at her with admiration, knowing that she had more courage than many leaders. Prime Minister Modi, too, faced challenges from within his own circle. Advisors warned him that pushing too hard for unity could weaken his political strength. One of them said sharply, "Sir, the people want security, not dreams. If we open our arms too wide, we may invite danger." Modi listened silently, his hands clasped together. After a long pause, he answered, "Security built on fear is not true security. It is only a cage. But respect gives people wings." His words silenced the room, but not the doubts that lingered in the minds of his advisors. Meanwhile, in a small town near the border, the first exchange of students under the new program had begun. An Indian boy named Arjun arrived at the home of a Pakistani family. He was nervous, his heart racing, afraid of how he would be treated. When he entered the house, he was met by silence at first. Then, the grandmother of the family walked forward. Her wrinkled hands reached out and she gently touched his forehead. "You are a guest," she said softly, "and a guest is a blessing." Arjun's eyes filled with tears as he realized he had stepped into a home, not an enemy's house. Back in India, a Pakistani girl named Zara lived with a family in Punjab. She had grown up hearing stories of hate, but here she was treated like a daughter. She shared meals with the family, played with their children, and even joined in their prayers. One evening, the father of the family told her, "Our nations may fight, but here in this home, there is only respect." Zara smiled, and for the first time in her life, she felt the heavy chains of division begin to break. But the enemies of respect were not silent. One night, as Arjun and Zara were preparing for a cultural event together with other students, news broke of a violent protest. Angry crowds had gathered outside, shouting slogans and demanding the exchange program be stopped. Fear swept through the students. Some wanted to run, others cried quietly. But then something remarkable happened. The students joined hands. Arjun looked at Zara, Zara looked at him, and together they said, "We will not be divided." Their voices were small compared to the crowd outside, but their unity gave them strength. Sundar received word of the protest and immediately arranged to speak live on television. His voice was calm, steady, but powerful. "Fear divides," he said, "but respect unites. Tonight, I ask every parent, every teacher, and every leader to look into the eyes of their children. Ask yourself, do you want them to inherit hate, or do you want them to inherit respect?" His words spread across millions of homes, and though not everyone agreed, many hearts began to soften. Modi, too, decided to act. He traveled to Punjab and visited a school where both Indian and Pakistani students studied side by side. Standing before them, he said, "The world will test you. It will try to break you. But if you hold on to respect, no force can defeat you. Remember this, walls are built with bricks, but bridges are built with hands. Use your hands to build bridges, not walls." The students stood and clapped, their young voices filling the hall with hope. Yet, while these acts inspired many, the storm was not over. Those who thrived on anger were planning something larger, something meant to shatter the fragile hope completely. The storm arrived without warning. What had begun as whispers of doubt and scattered protests suddenly exploded into something larger. In the heart of Lahore, a gathering of students who supported the exchange program was interrupted by masked men who hurled stones and shouted angry slogans. Panic spread through the crowd. Books and banners fell to the ground, and young students ran for safety. Yet, in the chaos, a small group of Indian and Pakistani students stood shoulder to shoulder, refusing to flee. One of them, a boy named Arjun, raised his voice above the noise. "We came here to show respect," he shouted, "and no one can take that away from us." His words trembled, but his courage did not break. In Delhi, a similar scene unfolded. A peaceful rally organized by students in support of unity was suddenly attacked by agitators who carried flags of hate instead of banners of peace. Chairs were overturned, loudspeakers were smashed, and people screamed as the crowd scattered. Yet amid the fear, a young Pakistani girl named Zara, who had been living in India as part of the exchange program, refused to run. She climbed onto the broken stage and held her flag high, not as a symbol of division, but as a plea for respect. Her voice shook the square as she declared, "If you destroy this stage, you will not destroy our hope." For a moment, even the angry shouts fell silent. News of these clashes spread quickly across both nations. Television screens filled with dramatic images of chaos, and many feared that the fragile movement of respect was about to collapse. Political leaders were pressured to shut down the exchange program, to end the meetings, and to return to old walls of safety. In hidden rooms, those who thrived on hate smiled, believing their plan had succeeded. They thought the spirit of respect was too fragile to survive such violence. But then something unexpected happened. Ordinary people began to step forward. In Lahore, shopkeepers opened their doors to shelter students who were running from the attackers. In Delhi, taxi drivers formed a circle around the rally to protect the students from further harm. Mothers from both sides wrote letters to newspapers saying, "Do not let our children inherit hate." Fathers stood in mosques and temples telling their neighbors, "Respect is our true strength." What the enemies of unity had not understood was that respect, once planted, could not be easily destroyed. It had already rooted itself in the hearts of common people. Sundar Pichai watched the news with a heavy heart, but when he saw the bravery of Arjun and Zara, his eyes filled with tears of pride. He called a press conference not to defend himself or the leaders, but to honor the students. "It is not me or Prime Minister Modi who carry this movement," he said softly. "It is the young who stand when the world tries to make them kneel. It is the people who open their doors when others shut theirs. This is the true power of respect." His words spread like a balm across two nations torn by doubt. Prime Minister Modi, too, refused to bend under pressure. Instead of canceling the program, he doubled it. He announced that even more students would be exchanged, more families would host, and more bridges would be built. His advisors warned him that this decision could backfire, that it could inflame the anger further. But Modi stood firm. "If respect cannot survive storms," he said, "then it is not real respect. And if it is real, the storm will only make it stronger." The following week, a powerful moment silenced many critics. Arjun and Zara were invited to speak together at an international summit with Sundar and Modi seated behind them. The hall was packed with leaders, journalists, and young people from across the world. The atmosphere was tense, filled with doubt about whether two students could calm the rising storm. But when Zara began to speak, her voice was steady. "I grew up believing that India was my enemy," she said. "But when I lived with an Indian family, I saw kindness in their eyes. I saw respect at their table, and I cannot call kindness my enemy." Then Arjun took the microphone. "I was told to be afraid of Pakistan," he said. "But when I lived with a Pakistani family, I found a home. I found laughter. I found respect. How can I fear people who gave me their love?" The hall erupted in applause. Leaders who had doubted, journalists who had criticized, and students who had feared all stood on their feet. Sundar's face glowed with quiet pride, and Modi's eyes softened with emotion. It was no longer just a story of leaders. It was the story of ordinary people, carried by the voices of the young, proving that respect was stronger than fear. But deep in the shadows, those who thrived on division were not finished. They watched the summit with clenched fists and whispered plans. They knew that if this movement continued to grow, their power would fade. And so they prepared something even more dangerous, something meant not just to scare, but to break the spirit of respect once and for all. The shadows moved quickly. After the summit where Arjun and Zara had spoken, the enemies of respect realized their grip was slipping. The images of two students, one from India, one from Pakistan, standing hand in hand had spread across the world. Millions had watched their courage, and millions had begun to believe that peace might be possible. For those who built their power on hate, this was a threat too great to ignore. A plan was set in motion. One night, in the quiet streets of a border town, a bomb exploded near a community hall where Indian and Pakistani families had gathered for a cultural program. The blast shook the walls, shattered windows, and filled the air with fear. Though no lives were lost, the message was clear. The enemies of unity wanted to remind people that respect was fragile, that fear was always waiting. News of the attack spread across both nations. Anger returned, like an old wound being torn open. Some shouted for revenge, others demanded the program be stopped. Television screens filled with fiery voices once again, warning that respect had failed. In homes and streets, families felt the weight of doubt pressing on their hearts. But then something remarkable happened. The very next day, instead of closing their doors, the families who had been part of the program gathered in the damaged hall. The windows were still broken, the chairs still scattered, but they sat together, Indians and Pakistanis side by side. One father stood up and said, "We will not let fear decide for us. If we run now, then hate has already won." His words carried across the room, igniting courage in the hearts of all who listened. Sundar Pichai arrived quietly, without cameras, and walked into the damaged hall. He saw the broken glass on the floor, but he also saw the unbroken spirit in the eyes of the families. He bowed his head and said, "The walls may shake, but respect is unshakable when it lives here." He placed his hand on his chest and others followed, creating a circle of silent unity stronger than any weapon. Prime Minister Modi also refused to allow fear to dictate the future. He visited the site of the attack and spoke with survivors. His voice was calm but firm. "Those who planted this fear wanted to divide us. But look around, you are still here together. You are the answer they feared most." His words turned into headlines, not because they were dramatic, but because they reflected a truth that no bomb could silence. Across both nations, young people rose again. Students held peace marches, carrying candles instead of sticks, singing songs instead of shouting slogans. In Karachi, children painted murals of hands holding each other. In Mumbai, teachers organized gatherings where families from both sides shared meals. Slowly, the fear that the attackers had tried to plant was replaced by resilience. People were beginning to understand. Respect was not fragile. It was a fire that only grew stronger when tested. The final turning point came when Arjun and Zara were invited to speak again. This time in Wagah, the border where soldiers of both nations usually marched with rigid steps and sharp eyes. But on this day, the gates were opened not for soldiers, but for students. The two stood before a massive crowd gathered on both sides. The atmosphere was tense, yet filled with expectation. Zara began, her voice trembling but steadying as she spoke. They tried to scare us. They tried to make us run. But respect is not something that can be destroyed by stones or bombs. It lives in us. It lives in every person who chooses kindness over hate. Then Arjun stepped forward, his voice echoing across the border. We are not enemies. We are neighbors, and neighbors can choose respect. Today we stand not as Indian or Pakistani. We stand as human beings, the crowd erupted. On both sides of the border, people clapped, shouted, and even wept. Soldiers who had been trained to watch each other with suspicion lowered their rifles and saluted. For the first time in decades, Wagah was not a place of division, but a place of unity. Sundar and Modi stood quietly in the background, watching the young voices take the lead. They did not try to claim the moment. They knew that the future did not belong to speeches or power. It belonged to the people, especially the young, who had chosen to carry the spirit of respect forward. That night, as the world watched the images from Wagah, something shifted. News anchors, who once filled screens with arguments, spoke with softer tones. Headlines across the globe read, "Respect breaks the wall of hate." In homes across India and Pakistan, families sat together and whispered, "Maybe this time it will last." In the months that followed, the exchange programs expanded. More families welcomed students, more schools opened their doors, and more hands were extended across the border. The enemies of respect did not vanish, but their power weakened. Each act of kindness, each gesture of humility, each story of courage chipped away at the walls they had built. And so, what began as a single moment, Modi folding his hands and Sundar lowering his head, became something greater. It became a movement. It became proof that respect, once planted, could grow even in the harshest soil. It became the story of how two nations, scarred by history, began to heal not through politics or force, but through something far simpler and far stronger: respect.